Hello and welcome. I'm Rachel Stoll, Senior Vice President of Research Programs at the Stimson Center. Since 1989, the Stimson Center has been a trusted, independent source of research and analysis on the most pressing national security and foreign policy issues of our time. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome you to America at 100 Days, National Security and Global Influence, or as I like to think of it, 100 days and 100 minutes. Over the next hour and 40 minutes, Stimson Center experts will join us to explore American influence and activity since Inauguration Day. Our experts will examine the impacts of the first 100 days through three lenses: alliances and America first, the dollar and deglobalization, and making grand strategy great again. What has the last 100 days meant for traditional American alliances, and how are our adversaries looking on? How have new approaches to wielding economic power shifted market dynamics? And how is the U.S. shaping the notions of global influence and national interests? Our conversation will explore all of these issues and more. And you're in incredibly capable hands for the program to come. Driving today's conversation is Greg Myrie, National Security Correspondent for NPR. Before I hand things off, a few housekeeping items. This event is being recorded and will be available in full at stimson.org/events. Greg will be taking your questions throughout the event. So if you have a question at any point, please submit it at stimson.org/questions. Greg will get to as many questions as he can during the three sessions today, and we thank you for your patience. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for today's discussion. Greg Myrie is National Security Correspondent for NPR with a focus on the intelligence community, position that follows his many years as a foreign correspondent covering conflicts around the globe. He was previously the international editor for NPR.org, working closely with NPR correspondents abroad and national security correspondents in Washington. Before joining NPR, Myrie was a foreign correspondent for 20 years with the New York Times and the Associated Press. Among his many assignments, Greg's work brought him to South Africa in 1987, where he witnessed Nelson Mandela's release from prison, brought him to Moscow from 1996 to 1999 to cover the early days of Vladimir Putin as Russia's leader. And Greg was one of the first reporters to interview members of an obscure new group calling itself the Taliban. In his years abroad, Greg has traveled to more than 50 countries and reported on a dozen wars. So you're in capable hands indeed for the program ahead. Greg, welcome to you, and thanks for running the show for the next 90-some minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Much appreciated. So a big welcome to everyone who's joined us today. And as Rachel noted, I'll be hosting three panels here and one right after the other. So when one ends, stay tuned. We'll be going straight to the next ones. As Rachel mentioned, put your questions in to stimson.org/questions. We'll be incorporating them in our discussion today. And so with that, let's jump right in and get started. Our first panel is Alliances and America First, a look at how the Trump administration's early moves are reshaping U.S. global partnerships. We have three folks from the Stimson Center joining us today. We have Kelly Grieco. She is a senior fellow in Stimson's Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program. We also have Andrew Hyde, who's a senior fellow and director of multilateral financial diplomacy and Powering Peace programs at Stimson, and Nudara Yusuf, who is a research associate with the Global Governance, Justice, and Security program, where she is the executive coordinator of the Global Governance Innovation Network. So, Andrew, I'd like to start with you. Trump says he's reviewing all the U.S. global alliances and treaties. So, should the U.S. be more selective in reviewing alliances, treaties, some of which date back to 1945, 80 years ago? Give us a big picture look at what Trump is reviewing and where you think he might be onto something and where you might think he's not headed in the right direction.
Thanks, Greg, and great to be here. Thank you very much. This is an interesting process. I think that President Trump signaled even during the campaign that this would be sort of the direction he'd be going in. And to a certain extent, I think it's a healthy process, really having a fresh look in 2025 to say, are these alliances, some of which date back 80 years, really still relevant for U.S. Foreign policy, U.S. national interests? Does it make sense for us to have the alliances as they are now formed, or should they be, strengthened, weakened, shifted around? I think it can be a very healthy process. I think that the challenge here comes is that it's really being done in a different environment, obviously, as well. The president has put forth a number of issues in his first 100 days, a number of policies, a number of proposals. And so it's a little unclear how this alliance review will fit into a number of things that he's already started on doing. And so there's a degree of chaos attached to it. I think there's a degree, certainly uncertainty at the very least, that has left our allies somewhat high and dry in terms of understanding where things stand, where the direction of travel is going to actually end up taking them. So in that sense, I think it starts as a healthy process, but the way it's unfolding so far and some of the core principles underneath these alliances that are being questioned make me wonder a little whether this is going to really result in a healthier point for U.S. alliances and U.S. foreign policy.
Uh-huh. Hey, so Kelly, let's pick up on that, and let's look at NATO in particular. Can NATO be revised without being diminished or destroyed completely? I mean, can Europe play a larger role in Ukraine and across the continent in particular, or would this lead to just a huge diminishment of NATO?
Yes. So, I would say that for U.S. politicians have been polite about asking Europeans to spend more on their defense and do more for their security. They've been less polite at times about it as well, certainly the first Trump administration. But I think what we're seeing now is a lot of frustration being expressed about the fact that all of those requests have actually not really gone anywhere in terms of more serious approach to European security from the Europeans themselves. It's clear Europe needs to do more for its own security. If you look at what we're doing in the world today, we're committed in 3 key places. We're deeply involved in Europe, supporting Ukraine. We're deeply involved in the Middle East and even building up forces. And then we have our primary theater, which is in the Indo-Pacific. And trying to think about how to counter China there. And we simply don't have the resources to to be able to provide security in all of those areas simultaneously. We can't spend our way out of it. And Europe is a wealthy set of countries that are capable of doing more for their own security if they spend more. That doesn't have to mean the end of NATO. And I think it's important to emphasize that Vice President Vance and Secretary Hegseth, when they visited Europe, were very clear about that they remain committed to the alliance, but that they want to see a reimagined alliance in which Europe is actually taking primary responsibility for defense and the United States is in a backstop role. Now, I agree with Andrew. The question becomes how you do this in a thoughtful way. And there are probably concerns, legitimate concerns, about whether the Trump administration can manage this kind of transition.
And just a quick follow on that, Kelly. How quickly can Europe or European members of NATO adapt? If it's supplying or more help, military help to Ukraine or financial help, we're hearing what seem to be kind of one-off bits of assistance here and there. Can Europe do that? Even in an organized way, number one, but in a larger scale, number two, and move towards assuming that larger role. Is that something we can talk about in a matter of months or a year, or is it something that's a multi-year project?
Yes, I mean, I think in fairness, it's complex. It's a multi-year process to be able to do all of it, particularly if we're talking about supporting Ukraine and also providing and building up European defense as well. There are things that Europeans can do now to take over things in responsibility for Ukraine, like providing artillery, whether they have to go on the open market and buy that, they can buy more American weapons to then deliver to Ukraine. So there are options in terms of Ukraine. But trying to do that while also trying to build up European defense and compensate for some of the weaknesses they have, that is going to really strain budgets. Ultimately, they need to spend more money on European weapon systems, not necessarily just buying from the United States, building up their own defense industrial base. and being able to supplement US capabilities, particularly things that we really provide in a critical way to the alliance right now, like intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, command and control, space capabilities. These are things Europe's capable of doing, I would say, over a period of about 5 years if they make smart investments. But I'll just say, as someone who's been advocating for a long time for a rebalancing of the alliance commitments more towards Europe, I never advocated that this should happen overnight, that we turn the button off. First of all, it's not really possible to do that. It's always been about a thoughtful process of transitioning over 5 years. And so that is eminently doable, but Europe needs to start today.
And Nudara, a lot of this conversation has been about Ukraine, or perhaps a little bit the Middle East and Gaza, the Trump tariffs with China. But let's bring in the global South. We're hearing less about that. But how are they reacting, and do they feel they're sort of being left out of the conversation, or what are they picking up on?
Yeah, I think it sort of builds off of what Andrew and Kelly were saying, Greg, and happy to dive into some of the dynamics playing out there a little bit later. But we have been recognizing that we're no longer in a post-World War II kind of world order anymore. I think that conversation has been a long time coming. So you've been seeing these reminiscence of, okay, let's talk future of multilateralism, let's talk new world order type discussions happening for, I think, the better part of a decade, frankly. But there's yet to be that kind of triggering mechanism that really pushes people to have that conversation today. It's been a tomorrow never comes style scenario of like slow shift, let's kind of move into this process. And I think basically what's happened over the last 100 days is that trigger's been pulled. We're seeing like tomorrow happen today, frankly. And I think that's something that with the chaos that comes with it is leading to a lot of interesting dynamics. From the global South perspective, I think there's been a call for like questioning the transatlantic alliances, questioning the kind of Russia-US bipolarity, the US-China bipolarity. Countries like Brazil and India have been calling for multi-aligned world order for a very long time now, saying that actually we're in more of a multipolar economy and so forth. So I think actually, and what we're seeing play out in forums like the United Nations and BRICS recently, which concluded, again, all of which I'm happy to dive into a little bit. But there's finally, I think, some diplomatic leeway to try to kind of see where new alliances can shape out, see where the EU can start working with other countries, not just sort of their relationship with the US. And so whether this works out in a positive way for the United States is a whole other question. But I think from the global South, there is both trepidation and concern, but also a kind of tone of opportunity emerging, I think, quite swiftly.
Maybe you can pick up on the BRICS in particular. Have they, are they seeing opportunities here if the U.S. is walking away from some of these alliances and partnerships, or are they kind of left wondering how this is all going to play out? And do they want to jump in, or is it a more wait and see attitude, but maybe with an eye on the BRICS in particular?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a Goldilocks approach that we're seeing, like not too hot, not too cold in the way that they're moving forward. So the foreign ministers meeting for BRICS just concluded yesterday, actually. And for the first time in a long time, they didn't actually agree on a communique coming out of the foreign ministers meeting. There was a statement from Brazil, who's hosting BRICS. And I think, we'll expect to see an outcome in the July summit, but it was interesting to see that there was an agreement. What we did see is that all the countries of the BRICS alliance, including some of the new ones that joined, agreed on the need to centralize multilateral trade. So that was something that I think, with the blanket tariffs coming across the board, that was a kind of forcing mechanism for the BRICS alliance, which for a long time has been quite fractured. And there's been sort of a inability to agree on lots of key issues. And I think this might be a forcing mechanism for the BRICS alliance to start working together. Where the communique did fall short is that Egypt and Ethiopia, two of the more new members, didn't agree on Security Council reform language put forward by India, Brazil, and South Africa. I think largely kind of thinking about which country would represent Africa as a permanent member of the Security Council. But I do think that it's really the Trump effect was an elephant in the room. We definitely saw back in February, there was a retraction of the push for de-dollarizing. Brazil had initially in its presidency said, we're going to try and move away from the dollar, move away from the dependence on the US dollar, but that very quickly kind of fell short. So I think we're seeing a response to kind of Brinkman economics to say, okay, let's actually just hit pause on pushing too hard on anything. Let's kind of see where things stand, defend the baselines. And I know that China wanted to push more aggressively on condemning tariffs, naturally with 145%. But I think we're seeing some kind of unification of BRICS in some sense. And it'll be interesting to see how they respond once they've kind of defended their baseline and what happens at the summit in July.
So, Andrew, I'll put this to you, but I'd like to hear from all three of you on this. We saw some of this in Trump 1. Certainly the language was even more stark, perhaps, in talking about the U.S. pulling out of NATO, and a lot of these other issues were raised as well. So, what's going to be different this time? What different sort of outcome should we look for?
Yeah, I think. Of course, we make a big deal about the first 100 days, and for good reason in many respects, but 100 days isn't that long. So I think we should be somewhat humble in assessing things, too quickly or too much in. But certainly I've thought about, as you said, the differences between 1 and 2 in this respect. And I think that you're right. In Trump 1, we saw sort of more broadsides against the institutions themselves as institutions, the idea of pulling out of NATO, criticizing the European Union. I don't think any of that sentiment has gone away, but I have noticed that in fact some of that commentary in the first 3 months has really been much quieter on the institutional front. What you've seen, and Kelly alluded to it, certainly is the idea that the principles underneath those alliances, underneath the connections with those institutions, are probably in greater question in Trump 2.0 than they were even at the end of Trump 1.0. And so the principles, I think, is really the question that people are looking at and wondering. And I want to come back a little bit also to the comment, Kelly, you asked Kelly about sort of evidence, if you will, that, what does a rebalancing look like in the short term? And absolutely, I agree with her that this is a multi-year process in terms of really rebalancing those alliances. But early on, I think, seeing Europeans making politically difficult decisions, especially related to money, would be a good sign. And at the same time, we're dealing with a Europe that is, because of this process and also because of the other factors that Kelly mentioned, Ukraine, China, et cetera, I think Europe is having a bit of an identity crisis too, in terms of saying, well, who are we? What are we now going forward? And if we don't have this sort of fundamental US backstop or alliance, we're not the same. So what have we become? And I think that's a question that's going to also take some time to answer.
Kelly, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question you ask about what's different about Trump 2.0 from 1.0, because I feel like sometimes as we're living through it, we have a tendency to think that it's always unique and new, and we often said similar things during Trump 1. I would say, to me, what's really different about it, I think, is the pace of the actions, and we're trying to, see if we can get a peace deal in Ukraine. We're trying to negotiate some kind of deal with Iran. And there seems to be a lot of actions in a lot of areas, and just the pace of it is quite different. And I would just say in general that I think an important difference is that the individuals that were in place in Trump 1.0 and his foreign policy team were people that were actually in many respects very conventional in terms of, old hands in the Republican Party, so to speak. And didn't always agree with him. People that it didn't really make sense why he would appoint someone with like H.R. McMaster to his national security advisor, because they had a different worldview. We see a lot less of that in Trump 2.0. And so I think what we're seeing is him using his senior leadership to really implement his vision much faster. And sometimes that's about destroying things, it seems, but it's not as clear to me, at least in this Trump 2.0, what exactly the vision is of the administration to replace it. And I think that's really the question, is whether that will emerge in the coming months or years. I'm not sure it will.
Mhm. And Udara, anything else you'd like to add on that front?
Yeah, maybe. I think, there are a couple different global contexts as well that I think are worth accounting for, including, we're much further along the 2030 agenda. There's only sort of a couple years left to go there. We're in a post-Pact for the Future world as far as the United Nations is concerned, so operating in a slightly different environment. I also think what's really interesting, and this is something that we've discussed in the past as well, is he is interacting with a lot of different types of governments in the global south in his first term. So when a lot of elections happened last year, there were about 64 elections. A lot of global south countries actually moved a little bit further left than they were in the past. And so he's interacting with very different government structures in the global south. And I think there you see really three dynamics starting to play out. You've got sort of development dynamics happening in response to his executive orders. You've got trade restructuring happening, and you've got this kind of shifting world order, all of which are cascading together. So in the development context, I mean, we know that the export growth model doesn't really work anymore. We know that migration as a form of development doesn't really work anymore. Aid systems are also being cut. So when a country like Myanmar gets hit with a 45% tariff right after an earthquake, like, what is its new development model, right? And so I think we're seeing a lot more South-South cooperation happen in that context. And I think that wasn't as much of a trigger in Trump 1 as we're seeing now. I also think that some of this kind of recognition of current development models not working is, again, been on the agenda for a very long time. It was part of the United Nations Declaration on Future Generations. It's part of what global order and global systems have been pushing for. It's just that we're seeing a lot more triggers, as Kelly mentioned, happen a lot quicker this time round. Similarly with trade, we're seeing India and Brazil thinking about stepping up in big ways to fill gaps, not just China. And I think it's really worth paying attention to those middle powers who I think are activating in a much stronger way in Trump 2.0 than in 1.0.
Kelly, let me put this to you, but all of you should certainly feel free to jump in and pick up on this. Now, we've had this multi-administration discussion about a U.S. pivot to Asia. And the Biden administration did take some action on that front, whether it was closer relations with India and developing the Quad, the AUKUS sub-deal with Australia, bringing Japan and South Korea together with meetings in certain ways. Is this momentum that's likely to be kept up in your view? Or do you think that we're going to get bogged down in trade wars and trade tariffs and might that will either stall or in fact retreat?
Yes. So we're always talking about pivoting to Asia, it seems. And this administration, this time coming in, is saying the same thing. And it's fascinating to watch that, their energies are being spent in Europe, on Ukraine, and in the Middle East. And, we have a clearer sense where they're going, I think, into both regions, trying to get a peace deal over Ukraine and drawing down U.S. forces ultimately in Europe, trying to get a deal with Iran, probably to also, again, make U.S. presence more offshore in the Middle East. But it's far less clear what we're trying to achieve in the Indo-Pacific. When Hegseth went to visit, he gave sort of these kind of bland, very conventional, like you can rely on the United States. Not clear what exactly our policy is. It's certainly clear we want to be tough on China. That's a bipartisan consensus at this point. But how we're going to go about it, I would just say, is really unclear in the region. And it's a lot of the policies are really contradictory. We are saying we want a tough policy on China, of course, not just with the tariffs, but also in terms of deterrence in the region. But then we're also threatening tariffs on allies. And so how you have a tough on China policy and a tough on ally policy at the same time, it just simply doesn't work. And so I would say that's one of the really big questions after 100 days that I have, is exactly what our Indo-Pacific strategy will be. And I don't have a very good sense what it will be, other than I hope it's not going to be defined by that kind of incoherence of trying to do both at the same time, but really the policy not serving either end.
If I could underscore that briefly, I think it's been a long time in my lifetime that we've commingled trade policy and foreign policy. I think we've had maybe a luxury over the last couple of decades of really seeing those in separate baskets. And I ask myself sometimes whether the Trump administration came in and President Trump himself said, well, these are two different things. I'll just operate these things separately. But as Kelly just pointed out, they're not separate. And obviously allies and adversaries are taking a lot from tariff policies in the trade area and applying it to other foreign policy questions.
And just to maybe add a little bit on that as well, Greg, I think this kind of policy incoherence is something that we're seeing not just in the trade foreign policy kind of dichotomy, but in other places as well. The intent to say, actually, we want to continue engaging at the United Nations. We don't want to have Chinese influence at the United Nations, but also we're going to pull back on a whole bunch of support and not engage. Equally, the US is kind of set to host G20 next year, but isn't going to go to G20 this year. So there's, I think, certain incoherencies at play here that, as Andrew said, 100 days is still early in the game. And so we're going to see the effects of that play out soon.
Yeah. And Nahar, let me follow up on that. What about the way that maybe developing countries are looking at the US and China? And we've seen a lot of these countries looking for flexibility, wanting to be able to do both, maybe looking to the US for some security help, but wanting to trade with China. This must just, I'm imagining, further complicate the equation, but could you see some of the dynamics? I mean, please mention specific countries if you'd like, but this idea of trying to work with both the US and China, and without maybe trying to choose sides and having good relations with both.
I think counterintuitively, it's actually been a lot easier for countries to kind of play the dance floor in foreign policy lately. Or maybe that's intuitive. But I think we have seen in the last decade or so, a couple countries start to do this dance, and they were largely critiqued for it. I think of India as like a very obvious example of multi-aligned foreign policy. They would swing with a couple countries on one issue, swing with a couple others on another issue. Frankly, you could argue that a few countries like that doing that type of multi-aligned governance is what led to the kind of push towards a multipolar economic order. And so you saw certain countries start to play the field, and they were critiqued for it. They said, you're not picking a side, you're not kind of choosing a coherent, consistent policy. I think that's now being thought of as the advantageous route to kind of dance the dance in multilateral governance. And so you're seeing more countries start to pick up that kind of approach. And I think, frankly, the interesting shift of the US trying to pull Russia away from China in many forums, whether that be in BRICS, or we saw that in the United Nations vote, where the US unprecedentedly sided with Russia on a vote on Ukraine. And so you saw kind of this shift in now you could also work with Russia, with the US, and maybe with China. And so I think it's opened up a lot of opportunities for countries that have been looking to align in multiple ways and not have to pick a side for both their developing context, for their economic policies and their alliances. So I think we're moving from, look, you're either transatlantic alliance or you're other, into there's now a whole bunch of, permutations and combinations at play. And I think that actually produces a lot of development opportunities for many countries who had military kind of alliances with the US, but had roads built from China, and I think that is only going to increase over the next couple years.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say to that point, I think this is actually something that the Trump administration really misses about the world power today. In a weird way, he very much respects, it seems, power. That's something he understands as a currency in international relations, but he still sees it almost as a 20th century or 19th century world where it's really about a small number of great powers and spheres of influence. And while it's true that there are still great powers, I think he misses that the middle powers, the gap between these great powers and middle powers has gotten smaller. and that there's a lot more agency for middle powers. And so when he's making these demands, whether it be about tariffs or other things, he expects these middle and small powers to just accede to American demands. And I think he's surprised by the pushback. In a weird way, Nadara, you talked about multi-alignment, about other countries responding to the United States with, and U.S. trying to rival with multi-alignment. Trump's own inclinations around transactionalism would lend itself to a more multi-aligned U.S. policy. But I don't think that's necessarily what we're doing, but it would actually fit the world quite well if he could lean into that in a more consistent way around a multi-aligned policy. It would fit this sort of emerging multipolar world and more powerful middle powers. But I don't think that the administration has quite figured out the importance of this group of middle powers.
And also, if I could add on that, I think it's the tools being used, Kelly. I think, it's a preference for coercion over collaboration. So rather than sort of, assembling allies, that's the topic here today, and working together towards a common goal being led by the US, it's a zero-sum game. It's coercion. I'm going to make you do this because I have more power than you do.
And we've got a question along those lines from one of our viewers who's asking, what particular middle power should we look out for? Are there countries or coalitions, and particularly in the global South, that can fill the shoes of the U.S. when it comes to global aid? And then let me just add to that, one, global aid just in terms of meeting the need, and then number two, gaining influence from that. And maybe let's ask about how China fits into that, but any other countries as well. I throw that out to whoever wants to jump in.
I can maybe jump in quickly, and then keen to have Kelly and Andrew build as well. I think one indication of where to look for these emerging powers is at the United Nations. Now, there is a lot of questions of, relevance of the UN in multilateral order. I think one of the big values the UN brings, amongst I would argue many others, is it's a very helpful foreign policy signaling mechanism. It's a way for countries to vote together to signal their willingness to kind of step up on certain issues, step up and champion certain agendas. When the Summit of the Future took place last year in September 2024, the Pact for the Future was agreed. We saw a lot of this signaling happen. The countries that actually stepped up to see through the Pact for the Future, which almost didn't pass due to a Russian amendment, were the African countries, the group of African countries. We saw Mexico step up in a big way. We saw South Africa step up in a big way. We're also seeing there was, during negotiations, a group of 50 middle power countries led by Singapore that were in support of global governance. So I think it ended up being 64 countries at the end together, really pushing for this agreement on global governance reform. So I would say if you're looking for which countries should we be paying attention to, I would say look at the United Nations, look at the way countries are negotiating, the way they're swinging their votes, because I think that is a real signaling of the showcase of intent of which countries are willing to step up, stand up to the quote unquote big powers, and maneuver multilateralism in a way that starts to work for them.
I would build on that a little if I could by just mentioning, I think Nidar is absolutely right. Look at the United Nations, but also look at regional groupings of countries and ask, who are the leaders there? Who are beginning to step out and really speak for their region and other countries are looking to. So, in Southeast Asia, for example, you might be looking more at Indonesia these days, or in Africa, Nigeria, and others and South Africa who are playing big roles. Latin America, look at Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. Those are sort of regional leaders, I think, that would have not just the heft themselves, but the backing of their neighbors as well.
Yeah, Andrew, you said exactly the country I was thinking about in answer to this question, which is Indonesia. If I were to pick one country that I feel that we sorely neglect in U.S. foreign policy, it is Indonesia. It's critically important in the region because of its location and also as a growing power and, of course, as one of the leaders of Southeast Asia. And I would like to see it become a focus of U.S. policy more. I'm not particularly optimistic about that. Trump 1.0 was not particularly engaged with ASEAN as an organization. And of course, tariffs, the threat of tariffs against Southeast Asian countries, including Indonesia, make me quite concerned.
Let me ask about places you think might suffer from neglect. that if the U.S. Wants to be less involved, if the Trump administration doesn't feel it needs to get involved in places that are going through traumatic events, where that could hurt. One place I'll just mention from my own experience recently was Syria. I was in Syria in February, and the new government there, a lot of issues, but they're really trying to reach out to the world. Millions of Syrian refugees want to go back home. But there's no USAID providing tents. They don't have electricity. They don't have jobs. Trump has said from the White House, Syria is a mess. They don't need us. Russia has largely been kicked out. Iran has largely been kicked out. Syria is desperately looking for the world to help them rebuild. And yet without U.S. leadership, it seems that nobody else can step in a big way. We're seeing it in a smaller way from some Arab countries, for example. So I just mentioned that example, but other areas I would like to hear from all of you that you think neglect by the Trump administration may have consequences.
Well, certainly one big place, we've already touched on it a couple of times, is Africa. And then there, I think that the differences that I'm seeing, Trump 1.0 to 2.0 aren't it's very similar right now. Now, again, 100 days, it's early, it's hard to tell. But if you really do draw a line from where we went through with Trump 1.0, it seems like we're on the same track there, which is, I think neglect is the accurate word.
I'll disagree with Andrew a little bit on this one and say that, from a military perspective, if I were Africa, I would be happy to have a little bit of neglect from the United States. I would like to have, probably from their perspective, you look at the Libyan intervention and it created a lot of second, third order effects for its neighbors in terms of creating essentially chaos in North Africa. So there are regions, I think, where if the U.S. is less militarily active would benefit from less involvement and might actually improve stability and security. Where I'm concerned about neglect is actually more in terms of how we use diplomacy and economics, or the things like U.S. aid was doing. Just sort of the neglect of using other instruments of power and not just purely these coercive military tools. When we're taking these things out of our government, or at least downsizing things in the State Department, it's going to, I fear, lead us to even more militarizing our foreign policy, something we have a longstanding problem with. I would actually like to see more money going to the State Department and less money going to the Department of Defense, so that we could engage with states in other ways.
And maybe just to build on that, I think in terms of like some of the powerhouses we're going to see in the global South over the next couple of years, I think the Trump administration does have a decent relationship with India, but really has neglected its relationship with Brazil, which is hosting the G20, hosting BRICS, hosting COP30, and is really kind of the hub for a lot of global conversations taking place over the next year or so. So I think that relationship is one that's got to be critically important. And maybe, Andrew spoke to economics, Kelly spoke to military, I'll speak to the humanitarian side of things. I think that there's a lot of countries that are going to face some really severe impacts because of just the lack of humanitarian support coming from the United States. Take Myanmar, Colombia, Afghanistan, Syria being one example, Palestine being another. We're going to see a lot of that fallout really cause migration pressures, refugee pressures, economic pressures, and so much more that I think, in the end will come back and hit the United States in one way or another. So I think thinking through what alternative mechanisms are through diplomacy, through what development and humanitarian aid can start to look like is going to be particularly important, especially with the US pulling out of UNRWA and other agencies that are supporting this process.
It just seems to me that we're the U.S. is voluntarily surrendering the tools of soft power, as both Nudar and Kelly have mentioned.
Right, because the boomerang effect is something that is soft power, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Countries being able to reach out to these bigger powers to help with interventions.
We are out of time, folks, but I want to thank all of you, Kelly, Andrew, Nudara. Thank you so much for this excellent conversation looking at the U.S. alliances and where they may be headed. We are going on to another panel right away, so please stay tuned. The next one will be the dollar and deglobalization. We'll be looking at U.S. economic power in this changing international order. So thank you very much to our first panel, and we will now go straight to our second panel here. Give me 1 second as I get myself organized here. So as I mentioned, we'll be talking about the dollar and deglobalization. And our panelists here are Bob Manning, who is a distinguished fellow with Stimson's Strategic Foresight Hub, and Yoon Sun, who's a senior fellow, director of the China program and co-director of the East Asia program at the Stimson Center. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So let's start off talking, tariffs. This would be complicated enough in normal times. These trade talks seem to take forever to work out. And President Trump is trying to do it quickly, but he's also doing it in this context of the U.S. retreat from a multilateral system with so many other balls in the air. So, Bob, let's start with you, but I'd like to hear from both of you on this. Have we ever seen a moment where you've tried to handle this much uncertainty about trade and tariffs?
I think there's more uncertainty in the world than any time since World War II, and not just tariffs, but the whole international system, because all the balls are kind of in the air, and the tariff levels are approaching what they were in the 1930s. We don't know because one day they're on and the next day they're off, and but I think we know. What we do know is his 10% tariffs are across the board, and he wants to keep those. Others, China, we talked about going from 145% with a big cut to 50%. That's huge. That's more than twice the tariffs he had on China in the first Trump term. So they're really serious trade distorting situation, particularly in Asia. All the whole Asian operating system, the whole production networks and export, the whole model of export growth is being challenged by Trump. So where does Vietnam go if it reduces its $123 million surplus with the United States? Because most of these countries trade more with China than they do with the United States. So, I think Trump seems to be wanting to force a choice. And I think if we do that, we're not going to like the answer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of the certainty, well, this is definitely the most unprecedented and the most serious trade war that we have seen in recent history. And the impact, I think the debate has been, well, who does the trade war hurt more, right? Because the countries that suffers more damage is more likely to cave. We have seen some assessment earlier from different sources that the U.S. had believed that China will be the first one to retreat, to fold, if you will. But now we have seen a very clear message from Beijing that they are going to put up a fight. They're going to retaliate. They're willing to risk the bilateral trade, even though it would translate into 2 to 3% of their GDP growth. We are at an awkward corner. That how do we climb down from the ladder here? There's a debate as for what the channel of communication would look like. Last week, the governor of the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, was here in Washington for the IMF spring meeting. And there was high hope that maybe he would have some meeting with the Trump administration to negotiate or to at least discuss how to start the negotiation on the trade dispute. But I don't think that meeting happened because technically the Central Bank of China is not responsible for trade negotiation, although he is one of the key economic policy decision makers. So the uncertainty that we're looking at is essentially what would be an exit out of the escalation where we are today. And given the two leaders of the two countries are both, I would say, leaders who demand ultimate respect from their own people and from their partners, it's very unlikely, in my view, quite unrealistic to expect either leader to pick up the phone first and call the other side, because that would be perceived as a sign of weakness. So I think that's part of the uncertainty, that what reliable channels or mechanisms we have between the two countries to properly address this current dispute, or this corner we're in, knowing that the two leaders are unlikely to carry out that role. That puts a lot of stress on the, I would say, the working mechanism or the working level officials to work this out. Thank you.
So my question to both of you is, who's going to give first, or who's going to feel the pain most the first? Now, I would think it would be pretty clear the U.S. is going to first to scream, just because we have a society where we're very open. People complain when they see things they don't like. You don't have those same outlets in China. But Bob, let me start with you. Who's going to feel the pain? Where is it going to hurt the most? And who, obviously we don't know how it's going to play out, but where do you see the pain hitting the hardest first?
Well, I think there's a structural asymmetry. Most of the things that we export to China, corn, soybeans, pork, beef, they can get elsewhere and have been doing that. But we get a lot of things like rare earth magnets that are critical for all kinds of electronic devices, and they've cut those off. So they've been honing a whole strategy for a while to make themselves U.S. proof. If you over the last several years, they've sold a lot of treasuries, they bought a lot of gold, they've stockpiled a lot of things. So I think they're girded for this, and we've already seen Trump backpedal, right? When the stock market was tanking and the dollar was tanking, and treasuries were falling, which is critical for our ability to pay our $37 trillion debt. He walked it back. And both sides have quietly made some exemptions already, even though they haven't talked. Trump has exempted computers, electronics, which we are very dependent on China from. China has exempted some computer chips and airplane parts and other things. So there's some quiet things going on. But I think Trump, is reinforcing Xi's narrative, which I think is I'm not sure the White House really understands that it's the whole Chinese victimization psychology, that we're being bullied by the U.S. and that it strengthens, and by hanging tough, Xi cares a lot more about control than economic growth, and by doing that, it's strengthening his image in China, and it's going to make it harder to make a deal, in my view.
Okay, Yun, you want to add it to it?
Yeah, I think I agree with Bob. I think now we're in a little bit of a game of a chicken, but it's also a war of attrition, right? This tariff is going to continue for a while, although I do believe that in the end there will be a negotiation, and this current level of tariff is unsustainable for either country. Basically, by the 60% of tariff, you already killed the trade. The tariff will be so prohibitively high that the trade will already be killed. So whether it's 100% or 145% or 200% doesn't really make a significant difference in terms of the number. But in the end, I believe the two economies will have to figure out a way. But we are going to look at a significant enhanced level of decoupling of the two economies, because I think U.S. has a fair point or a fair demand that we need to rebalance its economic relationship. But under the circumstances that we, meaning the United States, is unwilling to sell what we do best, meaning high-tech products, to China, the only way to address this unbalance is to force China to sell less. And that's where tariffs come in, right? So in that sense, I do see that the tariff so far, even if it will be corrected or adjusted later through a negotiation process, it will still have tremendous impact over the shape and the modality of the bilateral economic relations. Who does it hurt more? I think there's no doubt the Chinese economy will take a great hit from the tariff. And remember, the Chinese economic slowdown has been ongoing for the past few years. to the extent that Beijing punked the rest of the world so hard that their trade surplus last year was almost 1 trillion US dollars. Now, this year, if we're looking at US China trade being significantly reduced, then China will have to rely on something to maintain their economic growth if there is going to be a growth at all this year. But on the other hand, the supply shock for the US economy is even more severe. And we are a democracy, right? Our politicians are beholden to public opinion. And we are seeing the Trump administration spending its political capital, risking our economic consequences to wage this trade war. While on the other hand, the Chinese will claim that, well, we're better prepared. 7 years ago, we were caught by surprise and we still survived. 7 years later, we're much better prepared. We're in a better position to weather this. So I would say that even if the Chinese economy is going to take a lot of damage from the tariff war, the Chinese will most likely be able to sustain this tariff war longer and better than we will.
Mm-hmm. Just a reminder to everybody out there watching, we are taking questions and want to incorporate them right as soon as we get them. So please feel free. You can send your questions to stimson.org/questions. I wanted to ask, in my memory, trade negotiations take forever. They're so slow. It takes years. Even if both the U.S. and China, not to mention all the other trade deals Trump wants to do, but let's focus on the U.S. and China. Even if both countries want to do them in good faith, how long is this going to take? Can they reach some preliminary deal or compromise where the tariffs come down and they work out details? But isn't this something that would take an extended period? It's not a couple phone calls and a couple meetings.
Yeah, to negotiate a comprehensive grand bargain, if you will, to negotiate a big deal that will more comprehensively cover different aspects of the bilateral economic relations, that will take a lot of time. But my suspicion is that currently both leaders are looking for a face-saving way out. They're looking for symbolic wins. They're looking for those little nuggets or little pieces that they could claim that, hey, while US has won the tariff war and the Chinese have made concessions in these areas, and fentanyl being on the top of the list is most likely the first subject to be negotiated about. I think with those symbolic victories, we will be able to see the de-escalation of the tariff war, and then that will pave the ground for the working level officials to negotiate more comprehensively about what a grand bargain or a bigger deal would look like. But I think at this moment, it appears to me that the both governments or both capitals are looking for a graceful exit from the current escalated state, if you will.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Bob, you spent a fair amount of time in government. Can you just talk maybe from some of your own experiences what it was like when there is a tremendous upheaval, whether it's an economic upheaval or a war starting, and the difficulty of like trying to figure out what to do, even maybe just a change in administrations, because it would seem that it would be very challenging for people in the government, U.S. government right now, and perhaps foreign governments as well, to try to figure out where you go, how you act, especially when you have a president as unpredictable as Trump, who seems to be changing the targets and the goals on an almost daily basis.
Well, I think we're in a really unprecedented situation. So, I mean, I guess for shocks, 9/11 comes the closest, but that was in some ways easier to deal with because there's a uniform bipartisan response. I would say overreaction, but this time, he's one of the things he's targeted is government employees. So he's gutting the Foreign Service, and the State Department is greatly diminished already from people exiting. A lot of embassies don't have ambassadors. For example, now we have a crisis in India and Pakistan. We don't have ambassadors in either country, or assistant secretaries in the State Department for either country. So it's a very top heavy. Trump's the deal maker, and Everything is very personalistic. And so I don't know, I don't know we don't know where this is going. Well, we do see that there's certain things that Trump is sensitive to. Markets are one, I think polls are another. We just had the first decline, 0.3% decline in GDP, which of course he's blaming on Biden. But nonetheless, I think, most people see his tariffs as a big driver of that. So how he responds, where these tariffs are going, it's really not clear. I think in the deals they're trying to negotiate, they're looking at packages. For example, with our allies, South Korea and Japan, they're tying defense spending, host nation support for U.S. military presence in each country, to trade and everything. It's like a whole package of different elements. But I think, structurally, South Korea is a hub of electronics, computer chips, batteries, so on. We're going to probably have a trade deficit with them. So it's this flawed notion of what trade is, that trade is a zero-sum game. And if Canada sells us more oil and we buy stuff from them, then we're subsidizing them, was the term Trump uses. That's absurd, right? That's not what trade is all about. But so if you're following that logic, it's going to be very hard to see what kind of deals emerge. And it's very hard for our, just looking at the other side, for people trying to figure out what does Trump want, especially China. In terms of China, what deal is possible, right? We have bipartisan sort of demonization of China. So if you're thinking about things the Chinese would offer, for example, they'd be happy to build auto factories, battery factories, solar panels here and hire American workers. But would Congress allow that? I don't know. I think Trump has actually said he would be okay with it, but I think our political system would have a very, very difficult time digesting that. So I think the deal, as Yun said, I think the deal will be limited, and initially by just some small things, and then they will negotiate a bit more over time.
Mm-hmm. We've been talking about China, but you were just in Europe. Could you tell us where you were exactly and what impressions you got and how they're reacting to this first 100 days of Trump?
Yeah, I just got back from Europe last night, and the sense of uncertainty, how Europe has been rattled, and how uncertain they feel about the future. I think it really resonates across the board, regardless of which European countries you're talking about. Well, I would say that the big countries in Europe, UK, France, Germany, they probably feel a little bit more confident and resilient in terms of their future. But I think for other countries, especially the countries that are being, I would say on the front line of the Ukraine crisis, I think the sense of almost a fear and the uncertainty about their future is so significant that it's going to have a stronger repercussion across the board down the road. And here is where I feel the economic statecraft is closely associated with security policy, right? For Europe, I think the top priority, no doubt, is focused on the Ukraine crisis because of the abrupt and also almost a 180-degree change of the U.S. attitude towards the war. I think it creates a tremendous sense of fear and also unpredictability and uncertainty in Europe. And when they look at their economic relationship with both US and China, I think it has been the longstanding position of Europe that their trade relationship with China has never been problem-free. That's why the trade negotiation between China and Europe didn't go anywhere. That's why the investment agreement, it was also full of troubles, right? Now Europe is also concerned about Chinese EVs flooding the European market. But one thing that I would say that has changed in terms of the flavor or the degree of how Europe would position itself between the two great powers is, while China used to be seen as a problem, as a troublemaker, now China may still remains to be the same China with the same trouble, with the same disturbing policy that it does implement across the board. But Europe's perception of the United States has also been changing. and it's not in a positive direction. This doesn't mean that Europe will suddenly pivot to align itself with China, but we potentially will be seeing some more significant rebalancing of Europe in terms of their relationship with the United States, its dependence on US for its security, and how they calculate their relationship with China down the road. Again, that doesn't mean that they are going to completely shift their position 180 degrees, but how about 10 degrees? How about 15 degrees, right? And those are the nuances that eventually will manifest themselves in the great power competition and in terms of how the rest of the world will be positioning themselves between US and China, given the uncertainty they're faced with.
But we've seen the stock market take hits. We've seen a weakening dollar. We've just seen a decline in U.S. Treasuries. Do you think that these are limited, or do you think there's no clear bottom here? That if the trade talks don't go anywhere, if the tariffs remain in place, that we can see real free fall? Or do you think that Trump's responsiveness to some of these markets, that a lot of this is just the initial shock effect, and you may not react so strongly down the road? Where are we? Have we had a shock and maybe in for a few smaller ones, or do you see any boundaries, any guardrails on this?
Well, the dollar's not going to disappear as the reserve global currency anytime soon, but I think it's a gradual shift that's taking place. But I think the biggest factor are the intangibles. You know, the sense in much of the world that the U.S. they've lost trust in the U.S. in reliability. You know, Trump, a lot of the things he's doing, we have free trade agreements with a number of countries. For example, Singapore, we have a free trade agreement, and they actually have a deficit with us. And they were shocked when Trump put 10% tariffs on them anyway. So that kind of, there's a sense of chaos and untrustworthiness. And people don't make business decisions in that environment. That's one of the reasons we're starting to see a slide toward recession here, because businesses don't know what's going to happen from one Trump tweet to the next. And so they're holding back on investment. I think we're going to see a big shift in the next month or two, because a lot of the shipping and air freight containers are down like 50-60%. It's going to start showing up in a slowdown in ports and places like Los Angeles. And I don't know how much Walmart and Target have stockpiled things, but I think you're going to see prices going up and maybe some shortages on some things, and we'll see how is Trump going to react to that. It's hard to say, but I think in the broad process, the U.S. seems to be deglobalizing. They pulled out of a number of the WHO, some of the other UN agencies. In a speech at the IMF meeting, Secretary Besant accused the IMF and the World Bank of being too woke. And I don't say that we're going to pull out of the IMF and the World Bank anytime soon, but I wouldn't shock me. Because what he meant by woke is, for example, funding climate funding for the developing world, which is trying to adapt to climate change. It's hard for me to see the World Bank walking away from that, because the rest of the world is still going forward with trying to deal with climate change, even though Trump has no interest with it. Seems to have a disdain for wind power, for electric vehicles, and so on. So I don't know where that goes, but I think as a broad process, I think the world is starting to respond to a more marginalized U.S. role. And, in terms of Europe and China, I think it's going to be a transactional relationship, but I think it's an opportunity for China. I don't know if they're capable of realizing it. For example, will they, if the Chinese license technology for say batteries, what they're way ahead of us, and EVs, I think the Europeans would be interested in having them set up factories, because they've already done so in several countries, Spain and Hungary and Turkey, and but will the Chinese do that? They can't dump the $439 billion they export to the United States either in Europe or the global south. So for that China to realize an opportunity, they're going to have to move much stronger in the direction of building up domestic consumption, so they won't need to be so dependent on exports. And they've been very slow, and Yun can talk about it better than I, but they're very cautious to do that because she's afraid of losing control of the process.
Mhm. Yeah, and help us out with or help me out at least with the very basic question here. We're all talking about the 145% tariff on China, but for most other countries, that level seems to be around 10%, or at least the holding pattern that Trump's put everybody in is a 10%. Where does that fit in? And again, I know every country's trade has different tariff levels, and it can vary certainly product to product. But what is 10%? How does that compare to U.S. trade to Europe and a lot of other major Asian nations that are big U.S. trading partners?
Well, there has been this debate, right? So if U.S. tariff has been significantly lower on other countries than their tariff on us, and that is an unfairness that needs to be addressed. I think that's where the idea or the concept of the reciprocal treatment in terms of tariff that came from. But how is that being calculated? I think that's what people are disputing. Is that a simplified formula that you can just put the numbers together and then produce a nominal tariff rates that we believe that other countries are imposing on us? So there are a lot of questions about how that rate has been determined against these countries. But one thing is for sure, it definitely got everybody's attention, which is why we're seeing countries reaching out to the United States for trade negotiations. And a number of them, especially in the Asia Pacific, we're seeing Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, as well as India, quite eager to negotiate a trade deal with the United States. Actually, I believe some of the negotiations are actually ongoing as we speak. Trade is like water; it will flow to where the tariff is lower. But in terms of the US-China trade, what we have seen in the past 7 years is that, well, a lot of what used to be direct trade between US and China has in the past 7 years become indirect, meaning that China invests in a global South country, let's say Vietnam or Malaysia, and using Chinese parts and Chinese materials to process and to create the final products in these countries so that they can export to the US market, also so-called backdoor trade, export to the US market at a lower tariff rate, right? Well, that's globalization. That's where trade will naturally flow. But so I find it very challenging for US to address this question. That yes, you can have a lower tariff on these countries and a higher tariff on China, but how do you prevent China from using these countries to process their finished products to export to the United States? And I can hear you.
So let me ask this. We're just about out of time here. The final question, where are we going to be in 4 years? Are we still going to be wrestling with some of the issues that President Trump has ignited right now? Or do you think we'll be able to work through this and be in a better place in terms of global trade?
Bob, you want to go first?
Okay. Well, I don't know if it'll be a better place, but there's definitely a restructuring of the global trade system that's beginning. I don't know if it will be over in 4 years, but it will be much more developed, and we could see. I think you could imagine a more globalized system with the Europe, China, Asia collaborating and maybe reforming the WTO, or the U.S. might be reluctant. I'm not very optimistic. I think that the U.S. role as guarantor of both security and the economic system has been critical to the prosperity and relative peace we've seen over the last 70 years. And that's starting to be diminished, if not going away. And world systems don't work very well without either a coalition of countries or a hegemonic country to guide it. So I think, as I said from the beginning, all the balls are up in the air, and it's not clear to me where they're going to go.
Yeah, we'll give you the last word.
I share Bob's mentality. I think on U.S. China, by the end of this the second Trump term, we will be seeing a more balanced trade with China. But that balanced trade is also going, as my suspicion is going to be significantly smaller. And whether that is good news for the U.S. economy, that's subject to debate.
Mhm. I think we're going to have to leave it there, but I'd like to thank you both, Bob and Yun. Appreciate this excellent discussion on where the global economy is headed next. So now we are going to move on to our third panel, third and final panel, Make Grand Strategy Great Again, assessing the strategic implications of Trump's first 100 days. And joining us for this panel will be Chris Preble, who's a senior fellow at Stimson and director of the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program. Elizabeth Threlkeld is a senior fellow at Stimson and director of the South Asia Program. And Yuki Tatsumi, the Japan Program Director and East Asia Program Co-Director at Stimson. Welcome to all of you.
Hello.
And again, to our audience, please go ahead and put your questions in. We will incorporate them into the conversation as we go, so no need to wait till the end. We'll be happy to jump right in. Chris, let me start with you, but I want to address this to all of you. Before we ask about how to make grand strategy great again, perhaps you'd ask, does Donald Trump have a grand strategy or just a revolving set of issues that grab his attention for a little bit here and there?
Well, Greg, I think that's a great question. And I think that the president has certain instincts and impulses, some of which you can trace back over his long public life. He has always been skeptical of trade and a fan of tariffs, as the previous panel discussed. He has long been concerned about allied free riding, which the first panel discussed. But I think that what your question is the right one, because now that he is president again a second time, how will those instincts and impulses translate into grand strategy? Because as I've argued, in order to have a coherent grand strategy, you have to be able to prioritize. You have to be able to identify what are your core national security objectives, what are the sort of bottom line goals that you are trying to achieve, and a theory of how to get there, right? I mean, strategy at the most basic level is a path, a way, an objective, and an explanation, a story for how you achieve that. And I think the president has already struggled and will continue to struggle in making that consistent message, both to his own administration, to the American people, and to other countries around the world, to understand what are U.S. sort of core bottom line interests and how does it expect to achieve those interests over the next 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Yuki, would you like to pick up on that?
Sure. I think I agree with Chris that it is really prioritization. And thus, I would point out, and I'm sure Chris can elaborate on this, that so far it seems to me that rather than pursuing a more coherent, all of the national tools approach to this administration so far seemed to kind of take a more of a stovepiped approach, if you will, that they clearly continue to talk about how alliance should be, reciprocal and self-reinforcing and self-supplement, mutually supplementing. But at the same time, at the other end of the mouth, the administration also talks about this reciprocal tariff that previous panel talked about, which large swath of U.S. allies and its partner nations are included. So it seems to me that they try to pull in allies closer and a security and kind of make them more aligned with our defense priorities. But at the same time, what they're doing on a trade and commerce front is almost alienating them and kind of putting them, us against them. So I'm sure, Chris has a more thoughtful thing to say about that, but I would just like to point out a contradiction to start us off.
Mm-hmm. And Elizabeth?
Yeah, I would echo many of those comments. And picking up on what Yuki was saying, one thing that I've noticed, particularly in the context of the Indo-Pacific, is quite frankly how little we've heard about the Indo-Pacific over the course of the first 100 days. That really was a defining framework, certainly of the Biden administration, but dating back to the first Trump administration. And I at least had anticipated that that would come back in full force. There was an expectation that we would see, you know, a relatively hawkish approach on China, for example. And to Yuki and Chris's point, it seems to me that a lot of our focus so far has been driven by more kind of domestic political inflected interests, and that has translated through trade policy, economic policy. Immigration is something that's also come out with deportations, for example, in the India context within the region, and less perhaps on hard security threats, including from China. And that has undergirded a lot of kind of the motivating drive in Indo-Pacific policy, and kind of to Chris's point on prioritization, you know, what is it that we're aiming at or trying to compete with? And I think that hasn't come through as clearly as I would have anticipated sitting in this chair 100 days ago.
So, Elizabeth, I want to follow up with you. You know, we're talking about things that Trump or his administration is driving, things they may be talking about to see where they would like to head. But every president runs into crises. Things happen that aren't expected. And, you know, we've got some developments where we've had this attack in the part of Kashmir controlled by India. 26 people were killed. India says it's linked to Pakistan. Pakistan is denying involvement. Whatever the circumstances may be, it's a crisis, and we already have a question on this. And one of the viewer says, current news says there's, quote, credible intelligence that India will strike in 36 hours. Do you think the Trump administration will take a stance to preserve peace in the region? What mechanisms can the U.S., India, or Pakistan use to de-escalate? And, you know, is the Trump administration interested in getting involved?
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, it's something we're following closely. And this really, in many ways, will be the first major foreign policy acute crisis of this administration that wasn't something kind of ongoing, right? Ukraine or Gaza. This is new, though is a return to some of the crises that the first Trump administration faced. The last time that we saw an India-Pakistan crisis of this caliber was back in 2019 when Trump was also in office. So for those who haven't been following very closely, 26 people were killed in Indian-administered Kashmir on April 22nd in an attack targeting Hindu tourists in the part of the country that India's prime minister had worked very openly and publicly to project as safe and secure for tourism following some constitutional changes in 2019. And looking at the fallout from the crisis, this is the sort of trigger that has the potential to result in military action in retaliation from the Indian side, and from there, a very likely Pakistani military response. And so in a region that has two nuclear armed rivals, that raises a host of concerns in terms of the risk of escalation at the conventional level and potentially beyond. And so looking at the responses from the Trump administration so far, there have been a couple of that stand out. So in what seemed to be kind of an impromptu interview situation on Air Force One, President Trump alluded to this conflict having gone on for 1,500 years, and saying something to the effect of, you know, they'll get it sorted out. So the read of that was kind of the U.S. is not looking to get directly involved, not play a traditional crisis management role. And then just yesterday, out of the State Department, we heard a statement put out by the Secretary of State Rubio that suggested a more forward-leaning approach, that the U.S. was calling on both sides to exercise restraint. And that kind of takes us back to a more traditional role where the U.S. was looking to tamp things down. We've since seen a readout, at least, of a conversation that Secretary of State Rubio had with Pakistan's foreign minister, suggesting the U.S. is getting involved here. And I think perhaps that's an indication of just the reality of the risks of these crises, but also of the the bandwidth strain this administration is feeling right now. There's never a good time for a crisis, but this is a particularly difficult one, especially with so few administration officials currently having been confirmed, right? I think it was mentioned in the previous panel, we don't have ambassadors in Delhi or Islamabad. State is still filling out its ranks, even as it's navigating the very major changes that are happening structurally. And so, looking forward, I do anticipate, based on that messaging from the State Department, that the US is getting involved, but it's also harder. And this, getting back to the grand strategy piece of this conversation very briefly, this is going to be a difficult one for Washington to navigate. And I think we see here a real tension between the US-India security partnership that we have worked assiduously to build over the past 20 plus years, and also our concerns regarding nuclear escalation. And at a moment like this, India is going to be looking for support from the United States as it faces what it perceives to have been an attack in some way orchestrated or backed at least by Pakistan. And depending on how the US calibrates its response here, I think that could have lasting implications and will be watched very carefully and very closely in Delhi as perhaps a bit of a litmus test. So it's going to be a difficult moment for this administration to navigate, and one where I think it's quite likely that we are going to see military action going forward.
Okay. Wow. That's you buried the lead there, Elizabeth. Military action. Okay, we will be watching. Chris, I want to draw on something you mentioned initially about the Trump administration setting priorities. Obviously, China is a priority, but it's very much we're talking tariff and trade right now. We've heard less about the security piece. How do these two factors interact while Trump is trying to work out a trade arrangement with China? Does it affect the security? Can you walk and chew gum at the same time, or are they very closely related? And it will be, are you seeing what are you seeing on that front?
Well, first of all, I think that Elizabeth's point about the lack of people in place, experts in place with respect to South Asia and the crisis in Kashmir applies to many other areas of the Trump administration. So they have worked very quickly in certain places to fill roles and less so in other places. And I think, there's a saying, don't tell me your priorities, show me your budget. Show me where you're actually spending money. And I think we see that in the case of China and a focus on sort of military competition and a sense, perhaps less well articulated, that an economic competition that somehow weakens China will also contribute to our gaining the upper hand on them militarily. The problem, as the previous panel discussed, is that China has multiple trading partners, not just the United States, and many of those trading partners are American allies who are protected by the very weapons that you're buying more of to reassure them to compete with China militarily. So to answer your question, you can see how these competing impulses conflict as a matter of policy, and they make it nearly impossible to craft a coherent policy that where all the different pieces are fitting together. And I think the clearest indication of that is on the militarization, the increasing militarization of the competition with China. And I think that's reflected, back to my point about the budget, that's reflected in the Trump administration's decision to significantly increase spending for the Pentagon at a time when it is making cuts to virtually every other discretionary spending area, including in things like diplomacy and soft power, which are experiencing some pretty significant cuts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yuki, Japan's Prime Minister Ishiba met with Trump back in February. I know Japan has had trade negotiators in Washington. Japan really seems to be trying to get out ahead and figure out what the relationship might be like with the Trump administration. One thing I was hearing, and this may be dated at this point, but the Japanese trade mission was they weren't quite clear what was being asked of them or what was being expected. What kind of sense are you getting? I'll ask it specifically about Japan, but feel free to broaden it out about countries trying to figure out what the U.S. approach is. What's the strategy? What is being sought?
I think thanks for the question. I think Japan's chief trade negotiators are in town this week. He was responding to questions to a Japanese press like right before their departure in Tokyo. This actually will be the first round of real negotiations between him and the Secretary of Defense on the more specifics of what this deal might look like. And like you mentioned, Greg, what Trump administration side asked of demanded of Japan has been pretty clear. And then I think Japan is still trying to figure out what kind of a package it would offer to start on the negotiating on a more specifics. So part of that, I think, on the parallel, they are watching U.S.-China interaction, whatever there may be on a trade front. Watch very closely because what ends up being shut out of Chinese market when it comes to U.S. farm product, it's something that Japan might be able to offer that they would absorb into their own market, something like soybeans and corns. But then I think they're very also aware that what they might or might not be able to achieve in these trade negotiations could set precedents for other countries in the Indo-Pacific region and broader international community that will eventually have to go into this kind of negotiations vis-a-vis Trump administration. So I think they're very clearly aware of what they are doing right now, and for the next 90 days could set a precedent with which this administration might use to kind of leverage against the other trade negotiations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Elizabeth, we have a question from a listener asking about the implications of the efforts to reduce the bureaucracy in government, and the State Department is being part of that. So let me just tweak that question just a little bit, and you feel free to talk about the way that the bureaucracy is being cut. But the State Department in particular has come out with a plan talking about realignment. Would you venture a guess on what that might mean? Was it time for an update and looking at some of the arrangements that may have been in place for a long time? Some people are saying this wasn't as harsh as some earlier drafts were going about. It looked like it had more the fingerprints of Marco Rubio rather than Doge. Could you talk about, though, in general, this restructuring, in particular with reference to the State Department and what it might mean for the U.S. Role in the world?
Sure. And, I think I can take that on maybe through the microcosm of U.S. policy in South Asia or the U.S.-India relationship right now, looking at some of these big goals that have been articulated through the two high-level engagements that we've seen, right? Prime Minister Modi was out in February and Vice President Vance was just over in Delhi a couple of weeks ago. And when you think about the level of momentum that the Trump administration at the highest levels seems to be trying to inject in this relationship, both in terms of trade negotiations, but also just moving forward across the real breadth of the relationship, right? There are a few, 5 or so different lines of effort that have been identified. Thinking about the how of actually implementing that work requires very detailed, very careful efforts at the working level. And not all of that, but a great deal of that happens in the trenches of the State Department, right? And so thinking about trying to kind of take apart and move around and reconstruct the plane as we're flying it is a prospect with State Department reform, as with changes that have been carried out in other parts of the federal government, right? This isn't restricted to the State Department. It's something that we're seeing across the board. I think we do have to be very clear-eyed in terms of the challenges that that represents for implementing the policies of the Trump administration and moving forward. I think there has been great work done, not least by Chris's team at Stimson and elsewhere, on the question of State Department reform and the very necessary changes that, are needed to be able to advance American interests and American diplomacy in the world. But looking at what has come out so far, I think there are some real questions about what the impact is going to be, particularly on the USAID front, as that's being incorporated reportedly into regional bureaus. There are significant frictions there, and I think we're already starting to see some of the downstream consequences. Just lastly, this is related, though not directly part of your question. In the South Asia region, I also have to call out the Millennium Challenge Corporation as a pretty significant blow. The decision apparently to shutter that, especially in the context of the U.S.-Nepal relationship, which is, it's a small state, but it's critical in terms of U.S. competition with China. That was a long process of getting to the MCC compact. And so when we do see these dramatic changes that seem to be driven by kind of austerity-linked government reform efforts in the U.S., they have real measurable foreign policy impacts across the Indo-Pacific and beyond.
Chris, I'll put this to you, but I'd like to hear from all of you. President Trump immediately talked about ending wars. The Gaza ceasefire began the day before he took office, and Steve Witkoff was involved in the talks there. He famously said he could end the Ukraine war in a day, and he's been involved. And he's launched talks with Iran on a nuclear deal. He seems to have the impression that these can all be done quickly. It seems like he wants to get a ceasefire, get a deal, and then pull out. It's like problem solved, let's move on. Could you give us your take? As we see, it's not quick, it's not easy. It looks like all these are going to be hard. And if they do drag on, there's already some threats from Trump and others that will just walk away. Do you think that Trump and his administration will stick with it, will be forced to stick with these issues, even if they aren't making progress? Or do you have concerns that they may just sort of abandon some of these? I cited a couple, but perhaps those and others.
Well, I certainly do have concern that the United States would walk away, especially in those instances where the United States is clearly implicated in the conflict, if not in the present moment, in the roots of the conflict. And I think there are elements of that both with respect to Ukraine and with respect to Israel, Gaza. But your point is an excellent one, that I think that what we see is the president has a misplaced confidence both in his own ability as a negotiator and the power of his threats, but also, and this is a sore subject, but he talks a lot in terms of having cards to play and believing that the United States has a very strong hand in general, and we've seen that in the case of trade as well. But in the case of these conflicts, what I think he has encountered, he and his negotiators, is that the parties to these conflicts all have their own interests, and they do not respond in the same way to threats, to coercion, to incentives, to all these different things than a real estate partner conducting a deal for the sale of a building. These interests are deep-seated. It is informed by history and in some cases decades or longer. And I think the president's instincts here, his notion of wanting to get a deal and believing that if you just want it badly enough, the other side will come around to your point of view. I think he's learning a hard lesson here that no, as a matter of fact, the parties that are involved in these conflicts are not as convinced as he is of the need to bring them to a swift conclusion.
Yuki, could you weigh in on that and maybe sort of talk a little bit about what if the U.S. walks away? Trump has said, or Marco Rubio has said, if they can't get a deal in Ukraine, then we're just going to move on. In Gaza, you were hearing very little from the Trump administration. They don't seem to be putting any pressure on Israel, for example, or the fact that there's been a worsening humanitarian crisis with the blockade of assistance there. So it doesn't seem to be an idle threat.
Right. And I think that is an excellent point, because what's going on right now is especially for Japan, but then not just Japan, US allies in Indo-Pacific are watching how this administration responds to a difficult situation like this diplomatically very, very closely. Because for them, Japan's former Prime Minister Kishida, for example, had this famous phrase, for Ukraine today can be East Asia's tomorrow. And that just does not include conflicts that are ongoing. That also includes how US responds and how international community responds to these crises. So if Trump administration really does walk away because the deal is getting too hard, that has a huge repercussion, because US allies in Indo-Pacific takes it as first thing that they will think about is that what kind of a lesson does China draw from this? And only reason that pretty much the only reason that we haven't heard so much about Indo-Pacific up to this time is that at the beginning of the administration, it was in President Trump's mind, he would solve this conflict quickly or in a day, depending on which one, and then his administration will shift his entire strategic attention to China. But that is clearly not happening right now. So if this administration walks away from either of this current ongoing, very difficult diplomatic solution, that sends a huge repercussion of US credibility to bring these conflicts into conclusion, or at least facilitate that, and B, its resolve to its either commitments to the allies or commitment to what the goal that is set it is going to achieve. And the lessons that China or North Korea or Iran could be drawing from this is huge. And it's not in the interest of neither US allies, of course, but then ultimately, it's not in the interest of the United States either.
Elizabeth, did you want to have anything to add, or I can fire you a different question?
I can jump in on that briefly. I think across the world, like the ongoing negotiations that the U.S. and the Trump administration are involved in are obviously being watched with a great deal of interest in New Delhi as well. And I think similar to what Yuki was drawing on, there are questions and repercussions of these processes ongoing. I would point out that not under the Trump administration, but in the waning days of the Biden administration, we saw India and China reach a deal on disengagement at the border, and that has largely carried forward. We're seeing some more kind of, the Indian side will describe it as finding a floor in the relationship, mimicking the framing of the Biden administration in terms of U.S.-China engagement. But, I think the broader point here is that our allies and partners, and indeed adversaries in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, are not sitting idly by while this all plays out. They are looking after their own interests. They are seeking to hedge their bets predominantly until, kind of sticking a finger up in the wind to see which direction it's blowing. And that can continue for a time, but we shouldn't think of this as a stasis in which we are the only actor, and recognizing the ways in which countries across the region are trying to read, trying to engage, trying to respond to the Trump administration is a piece of this puzzle that I think will take on added weight the longer that this keeps up, to Yuki's point in terms of that early transition that perhaps was planned, but we haven't quite seen through yet.
Great. We're running out of time here. So one last quick round, one question for all of you. So Trump has been interested, both his first term and in his statements in this term, of wanting to pull back militarily, to have the U.S. less involved in open-ended wars, Ukraine, for example, being the leading example. On the other hand, the U.S. has been bombing Yemen every day, basically, since March 15th. There didn't seem a great demand, no public pressure from here for Trump to take that kind of action. Do you see a contradiction, or can you square that contradiction between Trump's desire to pull back and either threatening force in a number of cases, wanting to claim territory in other countries, and the actual use of force in Yemen. So about 30 seconds or so a piece on this. Chris, you go first.
I'll go first. One of my favorite expressions, Greg, is when you have a really big hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that more than anything else, and this is not unique to the Trump administration, the United States has had a really big military hammer for a long, long time. And if that's the one thing that you can reach for, and you think that that's the one thing that's going to produce the effect that you want, that's the thing you keep swinging. It is not producing that effect. And so what I would like to see is a greater recognition for the limits of military power and a greater appreciation and more investment in the other tools of American influence aside from the U.S. military.
Great, great. Yuki?
Yes, I was just giggling because the first thing that I came to my mind when you posed it, that Yemen question, is instant gratification. Because it is something that, like Chris said, U.S. hammer that could be wielded against something like that is huge and is very visible, it's very instant, and that it's something that he could immediately say, I did it. But what kind of a long-lasting impact does it have, at what cost, is something that more thinking on that is something that I would love to see from this administration moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth, you get the last word.
Yeah, just to round things out and foot stomp Chris's point on the importance of the broad spectrum of U.S. power, and not just hard power, but soft power as well. I think it's early days in the administration. At some point, we have to recognize that we're only 100 days in. There's a lot of time to go. And so I think inevitably there are going to be some different indications along the way as we're trying to read the tea leaves and figure out which way things are headed. So, important to point that out here. But I do hope that out of the experience in Yemen, there is a process of taking lessons and learning and adapting and recognizing that in these early days, as we figure out how the world today operates and how we operate in it, that there is a space and a need for the sort of capabilities that diplomats in the State Department and the full force of the U.S. government can bring to bear beyond just the military.
Great, great. Thank you all. I think we've got a wrap. So I really appreciate everything from Elizabeth, Chris, and Yuki on this panel, and our other experts that we heard from earlier today. Nudara, Kelly, Andrew, Yoon, Bob. And just as a reminder, this event has been recorded and it's available at stimson.org. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. I really enjoyed it. Hope you did as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks.